hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat.
Did you know, Kate Moss?
Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, oh my God, what's she doing now?
Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything, I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things, we've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference.
And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
The People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
You're an inspiration to us all.
Clip that bit up.
Well, you are.
That's my ringtone. My political ambitions those days are gone, I can tell you. She's only teasing. Go on. He's probably going to want to lay down now. I'll give him 2 minutes to have one. Let's respectfully disagree. That's what we like on Jubes and Kerr. Come and join us. GB News, the People's Channel.
Michelle Dewberry, weekday evenings at 6 o'clock.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
Good afternoon, welcome to Real Britain with me, Emily Carver, on TV, online and digital radio. Now we have lots to come on the show this afternoon for you. Boris Johnson has blasted Sue Gray's Partygate investigation as a cynical stitch-up. He says there is no evidence at all he misled Parliament, but the report seems to suggest otherwise. Is he right? Or is he a bit deluded? Has he fallen victim to, in his words, a kangaroo court? Or is it game over for Boris's political comeback? Then, Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, has described anti-ULEZ protesters as, guess what, far-right, COVID deniers and Tories. With pressure mounting, is this a sign of desperation? And Conservative MP Miriam Cates has called on the Prime Minister to consider an urgent review into age-inappropriate sex education in schools. Do you want your children learning about gender fluidity, trans identification, and that babies are assigned a gender at birth? All of that to come, but first, let's get the news with Tatiana Sanchez.
Emily, thank you very much. Good afternoon. It's 1 minute past 2. I'm Tatiana Sanchez. This is the latest from the GB Newsroom. New messages involving the former Health Secretary show him reacting to footage of him and his colleague, Gina Coladangelo, caught embracing during lockdown. The leaked WhatsApp message reading how bad are the photos was sent by Matt Hancock hours after he'd discovered pictures of him breaching social distancing rules had been published. The messages also show him discussing COVID guidance in place at the time and how he should respond to the media. The correspondence is among more than 100,000 messages obtained by the Daily Telegraph. Boris Johnson is facing fresh pressure after a report suggests breaches of COVID rules in Downing Street would have been obvious to him at the time. The Commons Privileges Committee, investigating his conduct during Partygate, believes the former Prime Minister may have misled Parliament at least 4 times. Mr Johnson says it was his belief all guidance had been followed and there's no evidence he knowingly or recklessly misled MPs. Former Special Advisor to Michael Gove, Charlie Rowley, told us Partygate is still a distraction for the government, who should be focusing on what really matters.
This is why, on the back of the inquiry that published their pre-report yesterday, on the back of messages that we're seeing leaked to the Telegraph that involved the former Health Secretary and the appointment of Sue Gray to the Labour Party as Chief of Staff to Sir Keir Starmer, I think this is why Labour will be happy for the country to be talking about Partygate again, because it is a distraction from allowing the government to tell the public and to deliver on what really matters to people, and that's education in the health service, it's stopping the small boats, it's getting the economy back on track.
The government's expected to announce new laws next week to crack down on small boats crossing the Channel. It's thought the new legislation will involve disallowing asylum claims from those who travel to the UK on small boats, as well as banning migrants from returning once removed. The Prime Minister has vowed to stop the boats as one of his 5 priorities. Next week's ambulance strikes in England and Wales have been suspended after the government have agreed to hold talks over pay. Tens of thousands of GMB and Unison workers had been due to walk out on Monday and Wednesday. But the unions have called off the action after saying ministers had offered potential pay rises for this year and next year. Charity Age UK has urged the government to step in as it says thousands of elderly people have died as a result of not getting proper care. Figures from NHS England show almost 29,000 requests for people aged 65 and over to be given support in 2021 to 2022, were in fact recorded as having died without any services being provided. The charity said the figures amount to over 500 deaths per week. The Health Department says it's providing up to £7.5 billion of funding over the next 2 years to support adult social care. The Ministry of Defence says Ukrainian forces defending Bakhmut are facing further pressure from Russia, with intense fighting in and around the city. Military intelligence has said resupply routes out of the town are increasingly limited, with 2 key bridges in Bakhmut destroyed in the last 36 hours. The MOD tweeted, whilst Ukraine's defence is reinforcing the area, the Russian army and private military group Wagner have made further advances into Bakhmut's northern suburbs. The UK is in for a cold snap next week, with temperatures expected to drop to below freezing. Monday and Tuesday will see lows of -3 in Scotland and -2 in the northwest and east of England. Yellow weather warnings for snow and ice are also in place from early Monday to late on Tuesday across northern Scotland and northeast England. The Met Office says the conditions are likely to cause some disruption to travel, as well as power outages. The oil used to anoint the king at the coronation on the 6th of May has been made sacred. A ceremony took place yesterday with the chrism oil consecrated in Jerusalem. It was carried out in one of the city's holiest Christian sites, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The Queen Consort will also be anointed with holy oil and crowned. This is GB News. We'll bring you more news as it happens. Now it's back to Real Britain with Emily.
Welcome to Real Britain. So here's what's coming up on the show. Did Boris Johnson allow himself to be bullied and manipulated into locking our country down? Leaked WhatsApp messages suggest some decisions were based on false data, public opinion rather than science, and even a bit of ego. Have lockdown skeptics now been vindicated? Then Sadiq Khan has come under fire for calling some of his ULEZ opponents far-right and COVID deniers. The London mayor has said he was only reacting to the vile messages on display outside the People's Question Time event in Ealing. But is this language a sign of a desperate politician? And later on, some Tory MPs have expressed their outrage that Partygate investigator Sue Gray has been offered a job as Sir Keir Starmer's Chief of Staff. Labour has insisted it did not approach her until after it was published. Boris says, though, it raises questions over the conclusions over her inquiry. But now the Privileges Committee says new evidence shows Mr Johnson may have repeatedly misled Commons over Partygate. What on earth is going on? We'll discuss that in a bit. So that's what we're talking about for the next hour. As always, I'd love to know your thoughts on today's topics. Please do tweet me at GBNews, or you can email me on gbviews@gbnews.uk. You can also watch us online on YouTube. I'll be back in a second. Welcome to Real Britain in 2023. A place where our Home Secretary is forced to come out and remind the public that we do not, in fact, have blasphemy laws in this country. That offending someone's religion or belief system is, in fact, not a crime. That schools and the police have a duty to prioritise physical safety of children over the hurt feelings of adults. Yet, this is the exact opposite of what we have seen in the cathedral city of Wakefield in West Yorkshire. In my view, this is without a doubt the biggest story of the week. We now live in a country where 4 students can be suspended for allegedly damaging a holy book, where dropping a copy of the Quran in a school in West Yorkshire can be recorded as a non-crime hate incident, where a 14-year-old autistic child involved can be on the receiving end of death threats, while a boy who sent the death threats is only given words of advice by a police officer. How can that be equality before the law? I don't suppose we'd seen the same reaction if a schoolboy had damaged a holy Bible. To me, the very fact that the police were even involved in such an incident is shocking, though perhaps not all that surprising. After all, as Braverman highlighted in her article in The Times today, a teacher from Batley is still in hiding after he dared to show his students a Charlie Hebdo cartoon of the Prophet Muhammad during a religious education class. We cannot bow down to religious extremism and bigotry for fear of offending. I think the shame should be on the school, the counsellors, the community leaders and police who have all played a role in this sham, not an autistic child who allegedly slightly damaged a Quran. Suella Braverman is right to come out strongly on this. We cannot continue to indulge those who wish for blasphemy to be a crime in this country. People might say that a child was immature to bring a copy of the Quran into school, but it's not this child who needs to grow up. I say it's the fully grown men who have chosen to be so offended by what should be considered a trivial matter. We cannot live in fear of causing offence. I'll say it to them, grow up. Let me know if you agree that that is the biggest story of the week. It is quite incredible that we seem to have blasphemy laws in this country running alongside our own law. Let me know what you think about that one. We'll be discussing that later with some brilliant guests, so stay tuned for that. But first, the journalist who leaked Matt Hancock's WhatsApp messages to The Telegraph has alleged they show a libertarian Boris Johnson was manipulated into supporting COVID lockdowns by Hancock. They also reveal a more lockdown sceptic, Rishi Sunak, who disagreed with Hancock over the extent of lockdown measures during the pandemic. So I'm asking, have lockdown sceptics now been vindicated in light of these messages, and do they portray Boris Johnson in a good light, actually? Now, joining me is a former Labour MP and Minister for Europe, Dennis McShane. Thank you very much, Dennis. And Director of the Academy of Ideas think tank, Baroness Claire Fox. Claire, I want to get your thoughts just first on whether you think it's right that these private communications were released in the way that they were.
I think that we can all have qualms about journalistic ethics, whether things given in confidence can be handed over, whether there's a breach of trust. But I think that Isabel Oakeshott has made a good case for this being in the public interest. And I would like to note that I had qualms about a lot of the information that was put in the public sphere. For example, all of the Partygate photos and so on were leaked, weren't they? And they were actually sent to journalists, and they then revealed them. And at the time, nobody said, oh, isn't that breaching private trust? In other words, I think that the more information we have, the better. And because of the slowness of getting an inquiry off the ground, I can understand why, despite reservations, this in the end is in the public interest.
Dennis, what do you think on that?
Really agree. Jonathan Powell, a little bit in the news because, of course, of the Sue Gray story. Jonathan was Tony's chief of staff, but from a very different diplomatic background. He was hired really for his foreign expertise as much as his management or person management. And he just said to me once, Dennis, as an MP, a minister, me, nothing is off the record. There's no journalist. Not a question of not trusting journalists. You talk to journalists, but always assume that anything you say, anything you give them could appear somewhere, maybe not to your credit. So I'm just astonished at Matt Hancock. I never thought he was very bright. I thought he was personable, but not very bright to give, 100,000? And WhatsApp's now worse than Twitter. I mean, we gabble and gobble on WhatsApp like nobody's business.
I do worry, though, that... SPADs, MPs, politicians, ministers at the heart of a crisis probably shouldn't have to worry about their WhatsApp messages being leaked. But then again, as you say, Matt Hancock was numpty, frankly, for doing so, I would say, to someone who is known as being a scoop journalist, always looking for a new story. Claire, do you think it's fair to say that Boris Johnson came out reasonably well from these leaked messages, insofar as he was at least trying, or at least expressing the view that perhaps it wasn't a good idea to at least go into that second lockdown?
I think what's most revealing, Emily, is that there were debates going on in those WhatsApp groups, including Boris Johnson, as you say, Rishi Sunak, all sorts of people, Helen Wakely, raising questions. They were raising the kind of questions that many of us raised about, do we really need to lock down? What about families being able to visit people in care homes? They had all the questions that I think many of us had. And it's not a question of whether they came out well or badly or what have you. They asked perfectly rational, serious questions. The problem was that when we in the public tried to ask those questions, we were immediately closed down and labelled as lockdown COVID skeptics, anti-science, COVID deniers, all of those things that were said. I mean, I raised questions like that in the House of Lords, and I actually found myself on a list put on there by a government minister as a COVID denier, a real smear attempt. So I'm gratified that they were asking the questions. What I really feel is being revealed is that they didn't trust the public to join in that conversation. And when they brought the press conferences to us in which they basically presented everything as definitive, there is no alternative, we have to do this, the science shows that, they didn't ever acknowledge that these were political choices they were making. I mean, we can have an argument. But
Claire,
the point was they implied there was no choice, we had to do it.
But it's also the case that they used public opinion to drive their policy. If these WhatsApp messages are as they appear, that they were thinking about lockdown and thinking about COVID restrictions, but said they didn't want to move too fast opening up because of public opinion wasn't there yet. So they were taking public opinion to decide policy in that way. But then it felt so oppressive at the time, the whole public discourse around this. And I do blame some parts of the media too, as well as ministers and politicians, that those who weren't on board with the whole lockdown thing were silenced.
I don't know if you're referring to me, but I do actually think that the public were treated as a stage army in that regard, not taken seriously at all. I mean, it's one thing saying public opinion, but the point was there wasn't a public discussion. And we were actually demobilised. Remember, not millions, but hundreds of thousands of members of the public at the beginning were willing to volunteer to offer to help the most vulnerable, said they'd go out and, they'd put their names into all sorts of things, organise community help for people who were isolated. And they were basically just told in the end not to do anything. The way that you help is to sit still, stay stum, don't move. And yet that created an atmosphere where you were passively waiting for the latest news. People got frightened because they were isolated. They weren't even able to have a chat with their mates about what was going on. And any attempt at asking those questions, as I say, was closed down. Censorship was deployed in terms of social media. We know that.
Yeah.
We also know that the media, and I think it's important to note that this was not just the government, but it was all sides of the political parties. I mean, sitting in the House of Lords, I have to say the opposition benches were like a baying mob. demanding that lockdown was harder and more vicious and.
Well, Claire, I'll bring in Dennis on. I'll bring in Dennis on this one. It did feel at the time that to go against the grain when it came to lockdown, COVID restrictions was not allowed. You felt a pariah in some ways if you were to call out the government's action on lockdown. Do you agree that that was the case, Dennis? Have lockdown sceptics now been vindicated by all this?
Anybody who's sceptical shouldn't need vindication because they're seeking to ask hard truths. Just a personal story. I've got a great German friend who offered me, she loves Britain, got a house here, about £6 million worth of PPE. She had in ready to go from Beijing, highest German standards. I phoned everybody I knew for free, just fly it in here. And nobody would be interested in a free offer like that. And then I found that so many Tory donors were in there getting on a special access to sell at a huge cost, some of it absolutely unusable PPE. But on the main point, no, the COVID inquiry will find out that. I mean, there was, if you like, a lockdown sceptic, Claire. That was Rishi Sunak. And he organised his Eat Out to Help Out. Do you remember that? I mean, he loves stunts dressed up in the waiter's clothes, like he goes to petrol stations to fill up his Kia, as if he knew what a Kia is. And he said, Eat Out, Help Out, it cost £500 million, and COVID cases went up by nearly 20%. So maybe some of the kind of sceptic stunt merchants were their own worst enemies. I looked at it across the whole of Europe. I mean, and each country had different approaches. I completely agree that the moment I hear the science says I duck for cover, but the idea that we all should have been, like Boris Johnson, boozing, sending people out to Tesco's to bring the wine in to all get sort of smashed in the office, I'm not sure that would have been much of a help to containing COVID either. Nobody knows. The Chinese had the most rigorous lockdown policy. They've had to relax it for economic reasons now, and now they've got a huge rise in cases.
But I think, Dennis, that may be, but Claire, if it's the case that government decision, policies that impacted, well, the millions of people that live in this country were based on flawed data and that was not expressed to the public, that is damning. Do you believe that the public inquiry would have looked into that? Were you concerned that the inquiry would have been a whitewash?
Oh, sorry, you're asking me.
Yes, sorry, Claire.
Look, the point is, it would just take too long. I was listening to what Dennis was saying. I'm not saying that we know exactly what policies we should or could have done. But one thing I want to clarify is that getting COVID and COVID cases were not as threatening for huge swathes of the population as the policies implied. There were people who were very, very vulnerable, and they actually, ironically, ended up getting neglected by this kind of treatment of one size fits all. So the people we should have been looking after were exactly the same as an 18-year-old. So I just went and spoke at university this day, and I was really struck by the students, how bitter they were about how they were treated. They were not vulnerable from COVID, but they actually had their lives destroyed in some ways for 3 years, and they haven't got over it. So that is one of the problems with having a kind of there is no alternative approach, and that's the way the government presented it. In fact, what I was saying was the only opposition that was very vocal were those who were saying you should do more to close things down. What about this group, this group, this group? So what we never had was a rational, sensible, open discussion. And what you have to do is trust the public to take decisions. When you call people granny killers, it's so insulting. Nobody wanted to put the elderly at risk. The idea that ordinary people were wandering around irresponsibly letting it rip, they would have taken precautions, but we were banned through the draconian.
Well, that's the thing. That's the thing, Claire. We treated children and young people, especially, as vectors of a virus that they were least at risk of, and they were treated as carriers of a virus, and therefore everything had to be closed. That's all we've got time for, though, unfortunately. Thank you very much indeed, Claire Fox there and Dennis McShane. Thank you very much indeed. So, moving on, plenty more to come this afternoon on Real Britain. After the break, Sadiq Khan has come under fire for calling some of his ULEZ opponents far-right, and COVID deniers. The London Mayor has said he was only reacting to the vile messages on display outside the People's Question Time event in Ealing. But some argue his language is alienating more right-leaning people across the country. What do you think? Does far-right even mean anything anymore? I think it makes the man look rather desperate myself. But first, let's have a look at the weather.
Hello there, I'm Craig Snow and here's your latest forecast from the Met Office. Well, as we go through the next few days, although this weekend will be rather cloudy and dry, next week is certainly turning a good deal colder with the risk of some snow for some of us. Out there at the moment, we've still got this area of high pressure firmly in charge across the country. This cold front will just be a focus of some showers across some eastern and northern parts of the UK. But for most of us, as we end Saturday, it's going to be dry but rather cloudy, with the best of any clear skies up across western Scotland. Later on in the night, we will start to see some wintry showers affecting the very far north of Scotland. But for many, no real problems with temperatures, no lower than around 3 to 4 degrees for a lot of the country. So Sunday for England and Wales, a very similar day to Saturday. Plenty of cloud around, risk of some showers across eastern parts of the country. For Scotland and Northern Ireland, I'm hopeful we will see a little bit more in the way of brightness compared to Saturday, but also the risk of some showers, and these showers once again will be wintry, especially across the high ground. Temperatures on Sunday at best around 8 to 9 degrees, but factor in the wind, it will still be feeling pretty cold if you are out and about. Into Sunday evening, across the north, an increase in risk of some showers, especially across Scotland, where these will turn increasingly to sleet and snow, even at lower levels, with the risk of some ice too. So do take some extra care if you are out and about early on Monday. Could just see some disruption courtesy of that snow. Further south, a colder night than Saturday night, maybe a touch of frost in a few spots where we do see the skies remain clearest. And then as we go into Monday, Tuesday and Wednesday, it turns even colder still across the UK. Risk of some snow, chiefly across the high ground at first. But as we go into middle of the week, we may even see some snow moving into the south too. But you can keep an eye on all the information through the warnings on the Met Office website.
Here on GB News Live, we'll be keeping you in the picture, finding out what's happening across the country and finding out why it matters to you. We'll have the facts fast with our team of reporters and specialist correspondents. Wherever it's happening, we'll be there from 12 noon on TV, radio and online. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, Nana, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
Hi, Andrew Pierce here. Join me every Friday lunchtime for a proper no-nonsense debrief of the week's events. With special guests in the studio and the GB News team on the ground, I'll be getting you up to date with news, some intelligent discussion and my own sharp take. The weekend starts here with me every Friday lunchtime on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Right, the London Mayor has said some protesters against ultra-low emission expansion in London are far-right, COVID or vaccine deniers. Here's a clip of Sadiq Khan's comments at People's Question Time event where demonstrators gathered outside.
What I find unacceptable, though, is some of those who've got legitimate objections joining hands with some of those outside who are part of a far-right group who are... Some of those outside, some of those, let's be frank, let's call a spade a spade. Some of those outside are part of the far right, some are COVID deniers, some are vaccine deniers, and some are Tories.
Vaccine deniers and Tories in the same sentence. Charming. So is Khan right? I don't think so. Or is this an unfair characterisation of the protesters? Joining me is London Assembly member Susan Hall, who is the leader of the City Hall Conservatives. Now, I've got on Susan today because she has been very vocal about Sadiq Khan's an outburst, really. What do you make of it all?
Well, I mean, this is a new low for him, isn't it? I was sitting one along from him. He was absolutely furious that anybody should question what he was saying and what he was doing. But to resort to calling us all far right, and he lumped the Tories in with that, which was unacceptable. But people were there justifiably complaining about the ULEZ. I've been out on the doorsteps today talking to people, and some people are almost in tears because they cannot afford to replace their cars. And I live in Harrow, so we're right on the outskirts of London, and they just don't know what they're going to do. And he just doesn't listen. He's not interested in what anybody says. As you know, he did a consultation which showed that people didn't want it, but he'd actually ordered the cameras before the consultation had finished. So, you know, it was a predetermination there. I mean, he was clearly going to go ahead, whatever happened.
Susan, I think it sounds like he's getting more desperate, and that's why he's throwing around these kind of accusations. But for the purpose of balance, can you tell me that there weren't any far-right protesters there, that there weren't any COVID vaccine deniers at this protest?
I didn't see any inside the hall. I got to the event long before it started. I was there at 6, and there were some people milling around outside. When colleagues came in later, I said, is there anybody outside? And somebody was saying that they were making vehicles honk as they went by if they agreed with them that the ULEZ should be stopped. So I didn't actually see any of it. There may have been a couple. I honestly don't know. I was inside.
But that's the thing. The purpose of what he said, in my opinion, was to blanket anyone who disagreed with him with the same brush, tar everyone with the same brush. But this is a trend that we're seeing in politics in general, isn't it? I mean, Nicola Sturgeon has said similar things about people who disagreed with her about her gender recognition reform bill. Is this just a way for people with progressive politics, left-wing politics, to discredit anyone who disagrees with them?
Well, I think it is. I mean, it's very unfortunate. We've seen Angela Rayner refer to Tories as scum, and apparently that's quite a common term. I remember once delivering leaflets and said it no scum Tory here. I can honestly say I've never heard any of my colleagues use any of those words to people that are in other parties. There's no need. We've got different political views, and we should have every right to say them. But I get on just as well with the leaders of the other groups in City Hall as I do with my own members. Clearly, we've got policy disagreements, but, you know, behaviour like this from Khan was just dreadful. And he was furious because he was being shouted at, and he just doesn't like that. He's very thin-skinned.
It seems that Sadiq Khan likes to exaggerate. He was on another radio station last week talking about the fact that no one can get their hands on tomatoes in this country, and I believe he was blaming Brexit for that. It does seem as though he's getting perhaps a little more extreme in his rhetoric. Do you think he's starting to get a bit worried about the next election?
I think he's suddenly, well, I think people around him are telling him that this Brexit, beg your pardon, this ULEZ could be the sort of Margaret Thatcher's poll tax. There's a total denial from him that people are as against it as they are. And I assure you, Emily, live in the outskirts of London, and people are desperate because they don't know how they're going to manage. People are angry, are furious because they've bothered to fill in the forms to say, no, don't do it. And he's just not listening to anybody.
Well, I know it's going to cost people hundreds of pounds a month just to essentially get into their car and drive anywhere for many, many people. Thank you very much, Susan, for joining us to discuss that. Susan Hall, who is the leader of the City Hall Conservatives at the London Assembly. Thank you very much for your time. Now, we reached out to Sadiq for a comment, but he wasn't available. However, a spokesperson for the Mayor of London said the Mayor stands by his decision to call out the vile messages on display outside the event in Ealing. Those who came to protest included people displaying Nazi symbols and spreading vaccine conspiracy theories. Unfortunately, there is a small group who appear to have latched on to ULEZ expansion to try to play on people's concerns and push their own agenda. The Mayor urges Londoners to look at the facts about ULEZ, to read the evidence about the damage air pollution is doing to people's health, and to be cautious about those who are clearly scaremongering and spreading misinformation. Whether in London or in any other part of the country, dangerous conspiracy theories and abhorrent far-right activity should always be condemned in the strongest possible terms. Well, there you go. Let me know what you think about Sadiq Khan's comments. I think he was essentially calling people who are against ULEZ all of these nasty names, and I personally don't think that's on. But let me know what you think. You're with GB News on TV and DAB Radio. After the break, some Tory MPs have expressed their outrage that Partygate investigator Sue Gray has been offered a job as Sir Keir Starmer's Chief of Staff. Labour has insisted it did not approach her until after it was published, but Boris says it raises questions over the conclusions in her inquiry. But now the Privileges Committee says new evidence shows Mr Johnson may have repeatedly misled the Commons over Partygate. Do you think Boris Johnson was stitched up, or is he only a victim of his own actions? We'll get stuck into that, but first, let's get a check on the news headlines with Tatiana Sanchez.
Emily, thank you. Good afternoon. This is the latest from the GB Newsroom. New messages involving the former Health Secretary show him reacting to footage of him and his colleague Gina Coladangelo caught embracing during lockdown. The leaked WhatsApp message reading "How bad are the photos" was sent by Matt Hancock hours after he'd discovered pictures of him breaching social distancing rules had been published. The messages also show him discussing COVID guidance in place at the time and how he should respond to the media. The correspondence is among more than 100,000 messages obtained by the Daily Telegraph. Boris Johnson is facing fresh pressure after a report suggests breaches of COVID rules in Downing Street would have been obvious to him at the time. The Commons Privileges Committee investigating his conduct during Partygate believes the former Prime Minister may have misled Parliament at least 4 times. Mr Johnson says it was his belief all guidance had been followed and that there's no evidence he knowingly or recklessly misled MPs. The government expected to announce new laws next week to crack down on small boats crossing the Channel. It's thought the new legislation will involve disallowing asylum claims from those who travel to the UK on small boats, as well as banning migrants from returning once removed. The Prime Minister has vowed to stop the boats as one of his 5 priorities. And the holy oil used to anoint the king during his coronation in May is vegan-friendly. It's been made with olives and scented with rose and cinnamon with no animal ingredients. It's also been made sacred in a ceremony in Jerusalem. The anointing of the new monarch will take place under a canopy at Westminster Abbey on the 6th of May, along with a coronation ceremony where the king will be crowned. TV, online and DAB+ radio. This is GB News.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things, we've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference. And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
You're an inspiration to us all.
Clip that bit off.
Well, you are.
That's my ringtone. My political ambitions those days are gone, I can tell you. She's only teasing. Go on. He's probably going to want to lay down now. I'll give him 2 minutes to have one. Let's respectfully disagree. That's what we like on Jubes and Kerr. Come and join us. GB News, the People's Channel.
Michelle Dewberry, weekday evenings at 6 o'clock.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage. Here on GB News, we will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
Welcome back. This is Real Britain on GB News on TV, online and digital radio. So Boris Johnson thinks he's been a victim of a cynical stitch-up. Senior parliamentary sources have reportedly told The Times that Boris Johnson could be suspended from the Commons for more than a month if the inquiry into whether he misled Parliament over Partygate finds against him. Johnson says the inquiry has found absolutely no evidence to suggest he knew the rules were being broken.
The reason there's no evidence to show that I must have known, or I must have believed that illegal events were taking place, is because I didn't. And I thought we were fighting COVID to the best of our ability in very difficult circumstances, in Number 10, in the Cabinet Office, night and day. And I believe that what we were doing was in conformity with the COVID regulation. So that is why I said what I said in Parliament.
So that's what Boris Johnson has to say, but the Cross-Party Privileges Committee said the Commons may have been misled multiple times. Johnson said it was, in quotes, surreal to discover that the committee proposes to rely on evidence culled and orchestrated by Sue Gray, who has just been appointed Chief of Staff to the leader of the Labour Party. So I'm asking, can we trust Sue Gray's inquiry, and has the former Prime Minister been stitched up? Now joining me is my political panel. Political commentator Emma Webb and the editor-in-chief of About Time magazine, Angelica Malin. So, Emma, do you think we can trust Sue Gray's inquiry, or is Boris right to say it's been a bit of a cynical stitch-up?
Well, I when I saw that this appointment had been made, I couldn't quite believe it, because it is, and I think Boris Johnson is right to say, and as is Jacob Rees-Mogg, to point out that this appointment stinks. I think it really brings into question her impartiality, and that she would go from writing the Sue Gray report to being appointed to such a senior position within the Labour Party so quickly. I think brings into question how, whether the entire process is actually quite partisan. And that's not to say that there hasn't been any wrongdoing, but I think before MPs make any decision about what action should be taken against Boris Johnson, there needs to be, as Jacob Rees-Mogg has proposed, an inquiry into Sue Gray to see for how long the negotiations have been taking place to put her in this post as Chief of Staff to Keir Starmer. Because as we saw, Keir Starmer was extremely evasive when he was questioned about how long these discussions had been taking place. So I think that there are some serious questions that need to be asked, so that the whole issue can be seen in the round, because I think this has become such a partisan issue in general. We need to take a step back We need to assess what has actually gone on here. But the long and short of this is, in my opinion, that the problem is the rules, the problem with the rules in the first place, not whether or not Boris Johnson broke them.
Well, yes, we're repeating the same arguments that we were having throughout the course of the pandemic, really, on this one. Angelica, do you take a different view? Do you not agree with Emma that this appointment, the fact that Sue Gray, a top civil servant, has now moved to a position, a highly political position, with Keir Starmer, although she led the Partygate investigation?
I mean, I think Sue Gray's decision to make this move is her own career choice here, and I actually don't think that this impacts the evidence that's come up in this inquiry. Like, facts are facts, whether or not you agree with what the rules were at the time. The fact is that rules were broken, quite obviously, with photographic evidence, with WhatsApp communications saying, I don't think this is within the rules, from Number 10 staff themselves. None of it to me is acceptable, especially given what the general public was sacrificing at that time. People were sticking to the rules, not seeing loved ones, all the things that we know, and the government needs to be accountable to that. So these things, like whether or not Boris Johnson has a political future, for me, like he shouldn't. He lied to the British public. He misled Parliament, and it's just not okay.
But Angelica, if the shoe was on the other foot, and it was the case that a senior civil servant in a Labour government suddenly took on a highly political role with a Conservative opposition, it does smack ever so slightly of corruption. Would you not agree, Angelica? Not even a slightest whiff of corruption.
I think corruption is a bit far, and I think that it distracts from the evidence that has come up in this inquiry. And I think it's an easy thing to hang on and say, well, Sue Gray is going to Labour, so that means that none of this, like no one should be accountable for any of these breaking of the lockdown rules. And I don't think it's as simple as that at all. And I think that the government still needs to be accountable for the rules that they broke at the time and what that did to the British public and how unfair that was given the sacrifice. And regardless of what Sue Gray decides to do now, this inquiry still stands.
Well, Emma, that's true. There has been evidence that Boris Johnson went to parties where alcohol was offered, where alcohol was drunk. It wasn't the civil servant Sue Gray who did that. Surely this is just... he only has his own actions to blame rather than Sue Gray.
Of course, I think that this is enormously hypocritical, but what it does is it points out the problem with the rules in the first place, which is that the British public were held to a higher standard of obedience to these rules, and they were obviously able to be interpreted, loopholes and so on. The government clearly, Number 10, didn't stick with the spirit of those laws. And Boris Johnson's argument so far seems to have essentially been that his understanding of the laws, his interpretation of them in a workplace setting was that this wasn't a party and this wasn't breaking the rules. So this just goes to show how when a government gives itself this much power to rule people's lives in terms of keeping them indoors, not allowing them to see their loved ones, that those rules can be used and abused. And I think that fundamentally is the problem. Yes, of course, Sue Gray is not responsible for Boris Johnson's actions, but I think that it does really seriously bring into question her ability really to carry out the role that she did. That's quite a serious issue if she was in discussions with the Labour Party and may have been, and as Jacob Rees-Mogg has pointed out, her son is actually involved with the Labour Party in Northern Ireland. The legal advice that she received was from a KC who's been overtly in support of Remain, highly critical of Boris Johnson, actually encouraged people to join the Labour Party. So I think that there are a lot of issues that are mashed up together here. But the point really is that the British public are very happy to, and the media also, to be trigger happy with making accusations of corruption when it's against the Conservative Party. But actually, as you said, this does smack of corruption. And I think that, we're liberal with the term in some respects and then not in others. So really, it's not just Boris Johnson that's being hypocritical here.
Well, lastly, Angelica, I'll go to you just to finish on this topic. People on the left-wing commentators, it's not just Conservatives or right-wingers or right-wing media outlets that have talked about the fact that this looks fishy. that it should be called out, that it should be investigated, this appointment. You know, left-wing commentators, left-wing journalists have been saying the very same. Would you at least welcome an inquiry into when discussions started between Sue Gray and Keir Starmer?
So I don't have an issue with an investigation into this appointment. However, I think it's really important that it doesn't overshadow the main inquiry going on, and I think it's an easy thing to distract from. And to the point before that these rules were open to interpretation, and they clearly weren't that clear because Johnson could not understand that he broke them. I don't believe that. I think they were clear, and I think he thought he was above the rules and that he could get away with it and wouldn't be held accountable. So they could have these obviously not socially distanced gatherings that involved alcohol and celebrations, etc. We all had birthdays, none of us celebrated them. So I think that that's a really important thing, that it's not overshadowed, even if there is a different separate inquiry into the appointment of Sue Gray.
Well, we will wait and see to see if this has thwarted his political comeback. It's very clear that Boris Johnson would like to see himself back in number 10, but perhaps he will find himself suspended instead. Thank you very much, Emma Webb, political commentator, and Angelica Malin. Will we be back with you in just one moment? But lots of you have been sending in your thoughts on the topics we have been discussing today. On Sadiq Khan's comments on those who protested ULEZ expansion, Alison says, I am disgusted with the manner in which Sadiq Khan has approached this entire ULEZ matter, and particularly his apparent disinterest in Londoners expressing their views both in the consultation and in the Ealing meeting. Very rude of him, and confirms his lack of statesmanship. I can't disagree with you there. On whether lockdown sceptics have been vindicated, Patricia has to say, I don't know anyone who didn't support lockdown. I think because we were afraid. But to keep us locked down for so long was a mistake, and I think we would have been locked down for longer if it were left to Starmer. Well, the evidence does suggest that that is true. On my monologue, Brian says, standing up for our rights as citizens of a so-called free country and for freedom of speech. Well done, Emily. That was, of course, me talking about what happened in Wakefield with boys being suspended and recorded as a non-crime hate incident for slightly damaging a Quran in a school. Let me know what you think about that. But thank you, as ever, for sending in your views. Now, to our next story. Rishi Sunak is reportedly considering an urgent review of sex education materials in schools, which have been called age inappropriate. The evidence presented to the Prime Minister was collected by the New Social Covenant Unit think tank. It alleges that children are exposed to unsuitably sexually explicit teaching resources and contested gender ideology, which is presented as facts. So I'm asking, should there be an inquiry, and should these sorts of things be taught to children? So back with me to debate this is my political panel, political commentator Emma Webb, and the editor-in-chief of About Time magazine, Angelica Malin. Angelica, do you think it's appropriate for schools to be teaching things like gender transition or gender fluidity, or that your gender is assigned at birth to young children?
Well, I think it's a very nuanced and difficult topic, and there's a lot of detail within it. I think what should be done is an independent body that is charged with coming into schools and delivering sex education, which is backed by research and campaigns and understanding of objectives. And I think it should be consistent among schools and not a varied curriculum between different schools. And I think more thought needs to go into it. And it's not just overworked teachers who are tired at the end of the day delivering these classes, but an independent body that can deliver them. I think that would be very important. And also age review. So one of the things that was flagged in this story was that it was from the ages of 8 and 9, which perhaps is too young to be teaching this kind of content. So I think a review into what kind of age is appropriate to start teaching sex education. But I do think it's important to have a well-rounded and balanced approach with these things, and for children to understand the reality of the world that they're living in, and a compassionate and understanding of people's different ideologies.
Emma, it's not just a case of one school doing this, teaching essentially ideology as fact or gender ideology as fact. There seem to be, every day, there seems to be another story about a school where inappropriate teachings are going on. What do you think? Is it time for a proper inquiry?
Well, this is a point that has been made many, many times, going back months, years even. Kemi Badenoch made this point in relation to critical race theory being taught in schools, that schools are teaching contested ideology as fact. And now, obviously, this is the case within what has become the gender debate or the transgender debate. I think this research from the New Social Covenant Unit is hugely welcome. I think that it would be absolutely right for this to be subject to some kind of public inquiry. But I also think that while such an inquiry is taking place, they need to halt whatever is being taught currently, because this is actually a safeguarding concern, and that's the fundamental point of this research. And Miriam Cates, MP, I think, is absolutely right in calling on Rishi Sunak to do something about this. And I think he needs to act on this urgently, because, as I say, this is a safeguarding concern. One of in the Telegraph report on this, one of these age-inappropriate lessons included teaching 9-year-old students about masturbation. We've seen a story in this last week in the Isle of Man of a drag queen teaching students this uncontested, and some people would probably say mad idea, that there are 73 genders. So there is a lot going on at the moment within schools, with the teaching of these contested ideologies, and I think we need to seriously look at the way that external providers are also being brought in on this. So the issue is actually, and this is Miriam Cates's point, that the Department for Education cannot be the people who investigate this, because actually the problem is with their 2019 guidance itself. So I think this needs to be looked at extremely urgently.
I mean, Angelica, I certainly agree with you, Emma, that it should be looked at urgently if this sort of thing is now commonplace, which it seems to be. Angelica, I think a lot of parents watching now, or grandparents watching now, would be horrified if they knew that their children were going to school and having a drag queen come in and teach their kids that there are 73 genders. I mean, it has gone too far, surely. This isn't progressive anymore. This is radical.
I think we have to be careful of there being one example of something within one school that happened and parents were distressed about it, and taking that and saying this is happening all over the country, we should take this urgent action, and whipping people into a frenzy. And these stories are often far and few between. In that instance, I don't want to comment personally on what I think about that, but if parents are unhappy, that should be dealt with independently. But I think, being careful that we're not just saying this is some kind of woke agenda, and the language that we're using around this kind of education, there is a place that is more compassionate and understanding. And it's important. It's important to understand the world that we're living in, and how children going out into that world, the kind of people they're going to interact with. So I think having a balanced sex education, I know when I was at school that it was a very lacking sex education. It was barely taught at all, and it was a kind of head in the sand approach, and that I don't think is any better. So I agree. I think an investigation is important, and then an independent review. And I think there's also a space where parents have a say in the curriculum as well, and how that's handled.
See, I think a lot of parents would prefer a sort of back to basics, birds and the bees kind of sex education, and for everything else to be left to parents who know their children best. But I could see your argument there, Angelica. But thank you very much for both of you for joining me today for today's political panel. Emma Webb, political commentator, and Angelica Malin, who is the editor-in-chief at About Time magazine. Thank you very much indeed. Now we've got a comment from a Department for Education spokesman who has said, "We have made relationships, sex and health education a compulsory part of the school curriculum to help young people to make informed decisions about their well-being, health and relationships. Schools must make sure all content they use is factual and age-appropriate, and engage with parents so they are aware of what their children are being taught." And Dame Rachel D'Souza, the Children's Commissioner, said, "There is no doubt that the duty to protect children from harmful or inappropriate content, both online and offline, is of paramount importance. But it is just as important that they are given the knowledge and skills they need to navigate the world around them and make sensible, informed judgments. That's why we must put their views and voices at the heart of how RSHE is taught, while also making sure that parents and carers are given reassurances about what they are learning." Well, I think a lot of parents watching this would like to know what their children are being taught and whether they can have a say in it. If you're going to make sex education compulsory, you have to make it applicable to all, I think, anyway. Well, this is Real Britain on GB News, on TV, online, digital, radio. Plenty more coming up on today's show. First, we'll go to the weather.
Hello there, I'm Craig Snow and here's your latest forecast from the Met Office. Well, as we go through the next few days, although this weekend will be rather cloudy and dry, next week is certainly turning a good deal colder with the risk of some snow for some of us. Out there at the moment, we've still got this area of high pressure firmly in charge across the country. This cold front will just be a focus of some showers across some eastern and northern parts of the UK. But for most of us, as we end Saturday, it's going to be dry but rather cloudy, with the best of any clear skies up across western Scotland. Later on in the night, we will start to see some wintry showers affecting the very far north of Scotland. But for many, no real problems with temperatures, no lower than around 3 to 4 degrees for a lot of the country. So Sunday for England and Wales, a very similar day to Saturday. Plenty of cloud around, risk of some showers across eastern parts of the country. For Scotland and Northern Ireland, I'm hopeful we will see a little bit more in the way of brightness compared to Saturday, but also the risk of some showers, and these showers once again will be wintry, especially across the high ground. Temperatures on Sunday at best around 8 to 9 degrees, but factor in the wind, it will still be feeling pretty cold if you are out and about. Into Sunday evening, across the north, an increase in risk of some showers, especially across Scotland, where these will turn increasingly to sleet and snow, even at lower levels, with the risk of some ice too. So do take some extra care if you are out and about early on Monday. Could just see some disruption courtesy of that snow. Further south, a colder night than Saturday night, maybe a touch of frost in a few spots where we do see the skies remain clearest. And then as we go into Monday, Tuesday and Wednesday, it turns even colder still across the UK. Risk of some snow, chiefly across the high ground at first, but as we go into middle of the week, we may even see some snow moving into the south too. But you can keep an eye on all the information through the warnings on the Met Office website.
I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Member of Parliament for North East Somerset and a former government minister. For years, I've walked the corridors of power in both Westminster and the City of London. I campaigned in the largest democratic vote in our island's story. I know this country has so much to be proud of. We need to have the arguments, the discussions on how we make it better. The wisdom of the nation is in its people. Vox Populi, Vox Dei. That's why I'm joining the People's Channel. Join me Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
First and foremost, I am a GB News fan, and I was before I was working here. Just love the fact that we're asking the questions that a lot of establishment media won't ask.
With a bit of a twist, we not only want to inform you, but we want to keep you entertained.
It's worth the drive because you get in and the team's all ready and waiting, they're itching to go, and it's a proper little family.
GB News is the People's Channel.
It's the audience that makes the programme sing.
We're giving our viewers and our listeners a voice. I see the thousands of your letters, tweets, emails, you name it, coming in.
Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it?
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you.
It's time for something different. It's time for GB News. I'm very patriotic. I believe in Britain. Our best days lie ahead.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Join us here on GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates. Do you not believe in prisons?
I don't believe in prisons.
I'm completely stunned. I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank. My father didn't love me. So anyway.
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to Real Britain with me, Emily Carver, on TV, online and digital radio. Now, plenty more coming up this hour. I want to know whether Suella Braverman was right to suggest political correctness has allowed Islamist terrorism to flourish. Also, it's World Obesity Day. Before we get stuck into that, let's get the news with Tatiana Sanchez.
Emily, thank you and good afternoon. It's 3 o'clock. This is the latest from the GB Newsroom. New messages involving the former Health Secretary show him reacting to footage of him and his colleague, Gina Coladangelo, caught embracing during lockdown. The leaked WhatsApp message reading "How bad are the photos" was sent by Matt Hancock hours after he'd discovered pictures of him breaching social distancing rules had been published. The messages also show him discussing COVID guidance in place at the time and how he should respond to the media. The correspondence is among more than 100,000 messages obtained by the Daily Telegraph. Boris Johnson is facing fresh pressure after a report suggests breaches of COVID rules in Downing Street would have been obvious to him at the time. The Commons Privileges Committee investigating his conduct during Partygate believes the former Prime Minister may have misled Parliament at least 4 times. Mr Johnson says it was his belief all guidance had been followed and there's no evidence he knowingly or recklessly misled MPs. Former Special Advisor to Michael Gove, Charlie Rowley, told us Partygate is still a distraction for the government, who should be focusing on what really matters.
This is why, on the back of the inquiry that published their pre-report yesterday, on the back of messages that we're seeing leaked to the Telegraph that involved the former Health Secretary and the appointment of Sue Gray to the Labour Party as Chief of Staff to Sir Keir Starmer, I think this is why Labour will be happy for the country to be talking about Partygate again, because it is a distraction from allowing the government to tell the public and to deliver on what really matters to people, and that's education in the health service, it's stopping the small boats, it's getting the economy back on track.
The government's expected to announce new laws next week to crack down on small boats crossing the Channel. It's thought the new legislation will involve disallowing asylum claims from those who travel to the UK on small boats, as well as banning migrants from returning once removed. The Prime Minister has vowed to stop the boats as one of his 5 priorities. Next week's ambulance strikes in England and Wales have been suspended after the government have agreed to hold talks over pay. Tens of thousands of GMB and Unison workers had been due to walk out on Monday and Wednesday, but the unions have called off the action after saying ministers had offered potential pay rises for this year and next year. Charity Age UK has urged the government to step in as it says thousands of elderly people have died as a result of not getting proper care. Figures from NHS England show almost 29,000 requests for people aged 65 and over to be given support in 2021 and 2022 were in fact recorded as having died without any services being provided whatsoever. The charity said the figures amount to over 500 deaths per week. The Health Department says it's providing up to £7.5 billion of funding over the next 2 years to support adult social care. The Ministry of Defence says Ukrainian forces defending Bakhmut are facing further pressure from Russia, with intense fighting in and around the city. Military intelligence has said resupply routes out of the town are increasingly limited, with 2 key bridges in Bakhmut destroyed in the last 36 hours. The MOD tweeted, whilst Ukraine's defence is reinforcing the area, the Russian army and private military group Wagner have made further advances into Bakhmut's northern suburbs. The UK is in for a cold snap next week, with temperatures expected to drop below freezing. Monday and Tuesday will see lows of -3 in Scotland and -2 in the northwest and east of England. Yellow weather warnings for snow and ice are also in place from early Monday to late on Tuesday across northern Scotland and northeast England. The Met Office says the conditions are likely to cause travel disruption as well as power outages. And the holy oil used to anoint the king during his coronation in May is vegan-friendly. It's been made with olives and scented with rose and cinnamon, with no animal ingredients. It's also been made sacred in a ceremony in Jerusalem. The anointing of the new monarch will take place under a canopy at Westminster Abbey on the 6th of May, along with a coronation ceremony where the king will be crowned. This is GB News. We'll bring you more news as it happens. Now it's back to Real Britain with Emily.
Yes, welcome back to Real Britain. Here's what's coming up on the show this hour. The Home Secretary is under fire for saying political correctness has let Islamist terrorism flourish in the UK. Braverman said that a highly coordinated Islamist network had been largely unchallenged as it spread propaganda and warped ideology, claiming that political correctness has created a blind spot in which extremists have operated under our radar. But does she have a point? I think so. Then the Duke and Duchess of Sussex have been asked to vacate their British base of Frogmore Cottage. That's what the couple's spokesperson has said. But the home might have a new resident very soon. Reports seem to suggest that none other than Prince Andrew has been offered the cottage keys by his brother, the King. What are your thoughts on that? And later on, it's World Obesity Day. But what's the point of having a day that celebrates obesity? It's an epidemic that can lead to some major health problems, including heart disease and diabetes. Do we need to tax and ban our way to being thin? I'll be joined by former presenter of Fat Family, Steve Miller, and Christopher Snowdon from the IEA to discuss that. That's what we're talking about for the next hour. I'd love to know your thoughts on today's topics. As always, you can tweet me at GB News or you can email me on gbviews@gbnews.uk. You can also watch us online on YouTube, of course. Back in a tick. Right, Suella Braverman has been talking tough this week. She's warned that political correctness has created a blind spot for Islamic terrorism to flourish. It comes after a review of the government's counter-extremism programme Prevent, which found Islamist radicalisation had not been tackled effectively. She also wrote in the Telegraph today, in the Times today, I believe, that she was appalled at the story of police recording a non-crime hate incident after an autistic teenage boy at a Wakefield school dropped a Quran that had been damaged. So, does she have a point? Is political correctness blinding our police and our blasphemy laws creeping back into our country by the back door through those who take offence? Joining me is former Metropolitan Police Detective Peter Blexley and author and broadcaster Rebecca Reid. We'll take this one by one, shall we? Peter, talking about Islamic terrorism, Suella Braverman was at this conference, this counter-extremism conference. She suggested that political correctness is allowing Islamic extremism to flourish, even if it's not violent extremism, non-violent extremism.
Well, political correctness, of course, can mean many different things to many different people, and to some people, the mere mention of the expression is toxic. However, Suella Braverman, perhaps slightly clumsily, has got a bit of a point here, because I prefer to use the expression afraid to tell the truth is creating a bit of a blind spot. Because we've seen on so many occasions law enforcement, because of the colour of somebody's skin or because of somebody's faith, being afraid, yes, afraid, to act without fear or favour, to act properly, to arrest perpetrators and to prevent crime. So it comes as no surprise to me that this might be seeping into counter-terrorism work.
Rebecca, thank you for joining us this afternoon. Do you think that Suella Braverman and Peter there have a point, that sometimes we are afraid to call a spade, and this can prevent us from dealing with extremism and then can go on to violent extremism?
I think the issue is there are certainly people who are afraid to be perceived as racist, but there is also an endemic issue with racism in policing, and the problem remains that when people are profiled on the colour of their skin by people who are in positions of authority, that creates a distrust for the police, which I think is entirely understandable. The same distrust that I see in a lot of women, given the current circumstances with members of the Met being under investigation for sexual impropriety. So I do understand that, look, I'm a white person. I hate the idea of saying the wrong thing. I put my foot in my mouth trying not to accidentally say something racist before, but in the same token, the police need to be able to navigate that difficult gap between not being a racist, but also I understand not being perceived as being racist.
Peter, I think when it comes to Islamism, we do have a special case. I mean, Suella Braverman has come out as well in the Times today very strongly to say that, no, we don't have blasphemy laws in this country. This, of course, refers to the case in Wakefield. A boy allegedly dropped a Quran, it got lightly scuffed, and then all hell broke loose. And the mother was brought to what one could say was a Sharia-style trial with a police officer present, a counsellor present, community leaders present. Surely the police should be prioritising the safety of children. The boy has been given death threats as a result of this, rather than people who were offended because their religion may have been offended in their view.
I saw some of the clips, the stills as well from that meeting, and to be perfectly frank, I was rather horrified because it cuts really to the malaise at the heart of so much policing these days, and that is that the fluffy 21st century police service has tried to be friends to everybody. It has this phrase, community engagement, and it's reached out with every minority group, campaign group, special interest group you can imagine, whilst largely forgetting the overwhelming majority of people who are law-abiding sit somewhere round about the centre and would like to know the name of their local neighbourhood cop. If police continue to pander whilst forgetting the law-abiding majority, then they are just going to continue to go down this fluffy route where they failed so many, and trusting policing as it is now is plummeting.
I mean, Rebecca, it is quite extraordinary that this situation, incident, if you can call it that, I think it's more trivial than an incident, was recorded by the police as a non-crime hate incident. What on earth is that about?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think you should be able to burn a Quran. I think you should be able to burn a Bible. I think you should be able to burn a Torah. I think if you paid for it and it's yours, you should be able to do whatever you want with it. It's a book. And if you don't believe in the religion, it's literally just a book. I found this uncomfortable too. What I dislike about it is that it's being used as a backdoor for people who just genuinely don't like Islam. Talk about how multiculturalism has failed. This is a really unpleasant experience, and I too found watching that sort of apology thing really uncomfortable, especially the fact that she covered her hair, and she's not somebody who covers her hair religiously for herself. I hated that a lot.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that we can suddenly use that as a stick to beat
But Rebecca, the examples, I get your point, I take your point, but the examples are mounting up. I mean, there is a teacher, as Suella Braverman said, there is a teacher still in hiding in Batley or wherever he's gone because he showed a picture of the Prophet Muhammad in a religious studies class. Yeah. I mean, the police, you know, there are angry protests. The police are seen to not do much. You have self-appointed community leaders talking about how offended they are. And it does seem to me, and to a lot of the public, I'm sure, that we seem to indulge this nonsense.
I mean, I think part of the problem is that these stories are unusual and shocking, which is why we hear so much about them. That's the nature of news, right? We always talk about the thing that's surprising. We don't talk about things that aren't surprising. So I don't think that this is the significant scale of problem that people are talking about it as if it is. I think it's that we get more upset about it because it is shocking. But I'm the first person to say that I think policing is failing. You know, I go on the channel every single week and say, defund the police. I think policing is failing. I disagree that it's because it's too fluffy. I agree. I think it's more to do with, I don't think fluffiness got us those WhatsApp groups talking, you know, using racial slurs, talking about raping women. But I think it's interesting that on both sides of the debate, we both agree that policing isn't working. And if people, you know, really on other sides are both saying it, then surely that's got to be true.
But Peter, Rebecca says these incidents are few and far between. Are they? Because we've been reading for years of Sharia-style trials in this country. We've seen protests over cartoons and over depictions of the Prophet Muhammad. We've seen counsellors indulging this. This isn't just a tiny fringe issue, is it?
This is policing pandering. And when police pander to the special needs or the special sensibilities of every single minority interest group there is, rather than focusing on what the public want, this is the route we go down. This is why confidence in the police tumbles. Because when they see all these resources being put into things that, quite frankly, is not of huge concern to many, many millions of people who don't want money wasted on police cars being painted in rainbow colours, for example, the public say, well, where are the police for me? I had my car stolen last night. I had my house burgled while I was away. My friend, my family member got assaulted, and investigations are closed down within a matter of hours with, quite frankly, nothing being done about it. Until policing gets back to the basics, which is keeping the streets safe, preventing crime, investigating crime promptly and swiftly when it happens, then the public are just going to shake their heads, and really the plummeting of trust and confidence in the police is utterly catastrophic.
Yes, I'm sure there are many unresolved burglaries in West Yorkshire and in Wakefield that people would prefer police officers to get stuck into and handle. Thank you very much, both of you. Rebecca Reid, author and broadcaster, and Peter Blexley, former Metropolitan Police detective. Some room for an agreement there. The head teacher of Kettlethorpe High School, where the Quran incident occurred, Tudor Griffiths, said in a statement, "We would like to reassure all our community that the Holy Book remains fully intact and that our initial inquiries indicate there was no malicious intent by those involved. However, we have made it very clear that their actions did not treat the Quran with the respect it should have. So those involved have been suspended, and we will be working with them to ensure they understand why their actions were unacceptable." I mean, goodness gracious me, that does sound a little bit like we have some kind of blasphemy law in this country. Anyway, the Times are reporting that the Prime Minister and his Home Secretary will reveal legislation that will make all asylum claims from those who come to the UK on small boats inadmissible, placing a duty on Braverman to remove as soon as reasonably practicable. Currently, asylum seekers have the right to remain in the country to have their case heard, but under these new plans, they will be barred from claiming asylum while in the UK, and once removed, they will be permanently banned from returning. Joining me is former UKIP MEP Stephen Wolfe. Stephen, I'm sure you've got some strong views on this. Thank you for joining me. Can you just talk me through what's changed here? Is this a significant development?
Well, in some ways it is a significant development. There is part legislation that we've got amongst the myriad of immigration laws that enables the government to be able to remove people from the country to other nation states for assessment of their asylum. And of course, we've had the Rwanda case that it was successful on behalf of the Home Office in defeating those challenges from the trade unions and the non-governmental organizations like Care for Calais, who tried to prevent the scheme. What is significant here is that it's allowing the government, and of course, we've got to wait till we see the actual legislation itself. I'm trying to find out behind the scenes exactly what the type of legislation is, and everyone is very, very stum about it, which is good in some ways, is really how they plan to remove people from this country without breaching, A, the UN Refugee Convention, of which we are signatories of, B, the European Courts of Human Rights and the Human Rights Act, and the ability, therefore, of lawyers representing those asylum applicants from challenging the courts in the various immigration appeals, particularly that from the Immigration Appeals First Tribunal.
Do you think that absolutely every person who crosses the channel in a boat to arrive here should not be allowed to claim asylum? You would have thought that in the boats there would be some people who may have a very genuine case, or would you dispute that?
No, and let's make it clear. From the outset of my campaigning research of legislation on immigration, I've always stated that it is very important that this nation has a very clear route for genuine asylum seekers to come into this country and make the claim. The question here is whether the claim should be made in the United Kingdom or it can be made elsewhere. My second main point was that it's a recognition that globally we now acknowledge that there are many people who come to different countries and claim asylum are economic migrants, and they are not the same type of people and should be distinctly treated differently. Now, what I see from this legislation and what I hear from those in government and MPs who are following this closely is that there is no intention from this government to prevent people who genuinely need the help of this state for fleeing asylum, particularly under the UN Convention for Refugees, that they should be denied asylum. The only question is whether they should be assessed here in the United Kingdom, where we have significant problems over housing and backlogs making delays really extensive, or whether they can be held elsewhere. And I think that, bearing in mind the influx that we've had over the past 5 years, it goes beyond 2018, it's a build-up for a long period of time, being able to assess people genuinely outside of the country in other areas is a significant move forward. This legislation hopefully enables the government to do that whilst maintaining our rights to look after those who seek genuine asylum.
I mean, the problem is, just lastly, very quickly, the problem is that the government, it seems to me anyway, as someone who observes this, of course, every day, what's going on, is that every time the government comes up with a plan, it is immediately demonised. The lawyers come out, the activists come out, the charity groups come out and say, no, you cannot do this. Do you think it's actually possible for our government to stop the small boats coming across? Because it's reached a point where it just seems unfeasible for it to continue.
It's always possible for a government to completely stop the boats coming across. There are numbers of ways that they can achieve it. They could return the boats under the laws of the sea and face an international confrontation.
But can they really? They can't really, though, can they?
But they won't. What this is attempting to do is disrupt the people smuggling model by putting fear into the hearts of them, by saying that we can't sell the deal anymore that you get directly to the United Kingdom because that you're now being moved to a different country for assessment, and there you may be turned down and never allowed to come in. That becomes a really significant element for people who are looking to put around £12,000 to £15,000 to travel from, say, Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, Somalia, to get to the United Kingdom, and then have to pay it off under the kind of lending model that people smugglers do. So that's where this is really important and very key. And if they manage to achieve this, and I do ask sometimes of those who genuinely believe in asylum, that they shouldn't be claiming everything the government does is simply trying to prevent people of different colours or nationalities from coming in. That is not the case. They should also recognise that this is a very distinct issue between genuine asylums, economic migrants, and those seeking to break the system. And if we all work together, this would be a much friendlier environment to achieve.
Thank you very much indeed, Stephen, for talking us through that. That was, of course, Stephen Wolfe, former UKIP MEP, discussing the latest on the small boats. Now, plenty more to come this afternoon on Real Britain after the break. It's been estimated by the Mail Online that the Duke and Duchess of Sussex, Harry and Meghan, have earned more than £100 million since they quit the firm and moved to the States. Has it all been worth it for them? I'll be speaking to one of my favourite royal commentators in just one tick. But first, let's have a short break.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything, I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things, we've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference. And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, Nana, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Hello, I'm Esther McVeigh.
And I'm Philip Davis.
Whether you're watching or listening on TV, online or on radio, we handpick the latest stories, debates and expert opinions for your weekend. So whether that's politics, news or showbiz, we've got it covered.
Join us every Saturday morning at 10 o'clock on GB News.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
GB News has its own late-night paper preview show, Headliners, where comedians take you through the next day's top news stories. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper, we've got it covered for you. Headliners, every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Nana Akue, Saturday and Sunday afternoons on GB News. Expect fiery debate and passionate discussion as me and my panel tackle some of the biggest topics hitting the headlines. It's a place for everyone's opinion. No one gets cancelled, but no one gets an easy ride.
Oh, she's on it today!
Be ready for conversations that are fierce, frank, and of course, fun. Every Saturday and Sunday afternoon from 4 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel.
We are GB News, the People's Channel.
And right across the United Kingdom.
You can find us on Sky Channel 512.
Virgin Media Channel 604.
Freesat Channel 216.
Freeview Channel 236.
And YouView Channel 236.
You can also take us with you on DAB Plus Radio.
With the GB News app and at the website gbnews.uk.
We're absolutely everywhere.
Come join us on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. This is Real Britain with me, Emily Carver. So, King Charles has given the boot to Harry and Meghan and is evicting the Sussexes from their UK home of Frogmore Cottage. The property was given to the couple by the Queen as a wedding present. Harry and Meghan are reported to be shocked at the development, though other reports actually say they're OK about leaving the cottage and say if we need to move out, we will get ourselves out. It's been reported Prince Andrew will move into Frogmore. And in other news, but related, the Mail Online has estimated today that the pair have racked up £100 million in earnings since they quit the firm and moved to the States. So, joining me is former BBC correspondent Michael Cole. Michael, thank you very much indeed for joining us this afternoon on Real Britain. So, where should we start? I'd like to start, if I may, with this amount of money that they seem to have accrued while being in the States. They don't really need the Frogmore Cottage anymore, do they? Or do you think they'll still consider this a massive snub and a slight to their egos?
Oh, well, what a week it has been, Emily. A right royal game of royal monopoly, or perhaps that's musical houses. As you say, Meghan and Harry have been given notice to quit, but that actually really recognises the reality of the situation. And the reality is that they're now committed to America. They're not coming back here, but this severs their last property link to this country. And as you say, I don't think they're going to be too fussed about that. They live in a hilltop fortress costing £11 million out at Montecito. And as you also indicated, they've now turned into the Montecito money machine. The estimate is that they are now worth more than £100 million. Now, how is that made up? Well, £81 million from Netflix. We all remember the 6-part Monathon, Harry and Meghan, just before Christmas time. I covered it with you and with the other stars of GB News. £25 million from Spotify, and then £16 million from Penguin Random House for a 4-book deal. And that actually looks quite good for the publisher because Spare the autobiography that he wrote, or in fact, an American journalist wrote for him, has been selling extraordinarily well. For a non-fiction book, it's broken a lot of records. And of course, it was one day after that was published on the 10th of January, that the king said enough is enough, and they were given notice to quit. What is it they say about revenge is a dish best eaten cold? Well, even royal porridge is probably best eaten cold.
Very good, very good. But so they're making all this cash, but is it worth the cost? Perhaps to their dignity.
That's absolutely the point. I mean, let's just look at it very coldly. What have they got to sell? Their royal connections. If their name were Mr. and Mrs. Harold Mountbatten Windsor, would we care? Would the Americans care? And there is strong evidence that the Americans are getting a bit fed up with them, or certainly losing interest. And their approval ratings, in his case, are down to -11. In her case, down to -17. And the great thing about America is that they always want the new thing. They want novelty. This is the home of nostalgia. This is where the old stars come and appear in pantomime. And we cherish those people. In America, they said, well, we've had that. That's old hat. That's as old as high button boots. What's next? And the thing is, what is next for them? All they've got to do is peddle their royal connections. Well, after a while, it becomes a yawn-a-thon. And at that stage, they're looking around. And of course, £100 million, wouldn't we all like to have it? Not bad for a boy who left Eton, one of the best schools in the world, with 2 A-levels. I think it was a B and a D in art and geography. So he's done pretty well. But if you've got round-the-clock security, perhaps 8-man detail all the time, well, that's going to burn through a lot of money, at least £3 million a year, it's estimated. And there are other expenses as well. So they'll have to look out for their other income streams. But I don't think that you and I, Emily, will be weeping for them. They're very lucky. They're good-looking people. They've got 2 beautiful children, healthy children. They've got all the money in the world. And they've got all these people saying yes to them. That doesn't happen to you and me, Emily. It doesn't. Has it ever happened?
Doesn't. No. Well, we do see a lot with celebrities that they get all this income, but they spend it very quickly. They burn through it very quickly indeed. And I'm sure, as you say, they've got huge outgoings. So they'll have to find something else to peddle to make money from. Anyway, thank you very much, Michael. Michael Cole, former BBC correspondent, with us to discuss the latest from the royals. You're with GB News on TV and DAB Radio. After the break, it is World Obesity Day. Celebrate. What's the point of having this day at all? How do you think we can, combat obesity? It seems that taxing more, banning more doesn't seem to be helping, but perhaps my panellists will disagree in just one moment. Steve Miller of Fat Families and Christopher Snowdon from the IEA. But first, let's get a check on the news headlines with Aaron Armstrong.
Hi there, it's 3:30 now, just after it. I'm Aaron Armstrong in the GB newsroom. New messages involving the former Health Secretary Matt Hancock show him reacting to footage of him and his colleague Gina Colandangelo caught embracing during lockdown. The leaked WhatsApp message reading "How bad are the photos" was sent by Hancock hours after he discovered pictures of him breaching social distancing rules had been published. Now, the messages also show him discussing COVID guidance in place at the time and how he should respond to the media. The correspondence is among more than 100,000 messages obtained by the Daily Telegraph. Boris Johnson's facing fresh pressure after a report suggests breaches of COVID rules in Downing Street would have been obvious to him at the time. The Commons Privileges Committee, investigating his conduct during Partygate, believes the former Prime Minister may have misled Parliament at least 4 times. Mr Johnson says it was his belief all guidance had been followed and there's no evidence he knowingly or recklessly misled MPs. The government's expected to announce new laws next week to crack down on small boats crossing the Channel. It's thought the new legislation will involve disallowing asylum claims from those who travel to the UK on small boats as well as banning migrants from returning once removed. The Prime Minister's vowed to stop the boats as one of his 5 priorities. The holy oil used to anoint the king during his coronation in May will be vegan-friendly. It's been made with olives and scented with rose and cinnamon with no animal ingredients. It's also been made sacred in a ceremony in Jerusalem. The anointing of the new monarch will take place under a canopy at Westminster Abbey on the 6th of May, along with a coronation ceremony where the king will be crowned. On TV, online and DAB+ radio, this is GB News. But don't go anywhere. Real Britain is back in just a moment.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, Nana, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Hi, Andrew Pierce here. Join me every Friday lunchtime for a proper no-nonsense debrief of the week's events. With special guests in the studio and the GB News team on the ground, I'll be getting you up to date with news, some intelligent discussion and my own sharp take. The weekend starts here with me every Friday lunchtime on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel. I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. This is Real Britain on GB News. Now today, believe it or not, it is World Obesity Day, and in the UK there's much to be worried about, apparently. Levels of obesity in the UK are expected to reach 64% by 2035. It's on the rise globally, and efforts to address it are challenging, perhaps due to misconceptions around obesity and the role it can play in a person's health. So, I want to know, how do we tackle the ever-growing issue of obesity? It seems on the one hand we want to celebrate big bodies, but on the other we want to tax and ban people into adopting a healthy lifestyle. It doesn't make sense to me, but joining me now is the former presenter of Fat Family, Steve Miller, and head of lifestyle economics at the IEA, Christopher Snowdon. So, Steve, we do have this conundrum at the moment. We want to celebrate people of all bodies, big and slim, but then we also seem to want to tax and ban people into submission. So what's the answer to this problem of obesity?
Well, it was interesting earlier, you talked about political correctness, and there is no doubt that over the last, 10 years, political correctness has made us more chubby. You know, you're not allowed to use the word fat, apparently, although that might be changing now. And if you dare, what's weird about this day is today is about being really concerned about obesity. Tomorrow, though, if people start saying, oh, it is wrong to be fat, they will be called a fat shamer, like I'm called quite often. The reality here, let's look at the numbers. 2/3 of the UK is too fat already. Half of the world is going to be overweight by 2035. Child obesity is predicted to increase by 100%. Yet apparently you should love your curves, i.e. your chunky bodies, and you should not be using the word fat because it'll upset people. I say nonsense to that. I think we have to be stronger. We have to, of course, give out the love, but we also have to get out that stick as well and start saying to people, fat is wrong. If you're fat, sort it out. It'll probably kill you. And you know what? If you're a parent of a fat child, be ashamed, because you are responsible for your child. We've got to get that sort of messaging out there.
Well, there you go. Chris, Steve wants to bring back a bit of shaming and presumably a bit of personal responsibility when it comes to being obese or stopping people from being obese. But you've looked into the evidence on all of this. You are a nanny state expert. Firstly, are we getting fatter? Is this a crisis? And secondly, does taxing sugary products, does banning marketing, etc., does that work?
Well, a few questions there. I mean, first one is obesity going up? Yes, it is, generally speaking. Not necessarily amongst children, but amongst adults it ticks up. It always goes up much slower than the predictions. And the purpose of World Obesity Day, as far as I can tell, is to allow people to come up with some risible forecasts about how obesity is going to double every few years, what have you. They've always been massively wrong, these forecasts. They just basically put a straight line through the chart and say, well, eventually everybody's going to be obese, which of course we won't be. What should we do about it? I mean, well, it's not a crisis. I certainly wouldn't consider it to be a crisis. I like to think that I can think of more important issues. You know, I think if I wrote a list of the 100 biggest issues facing the United Kingdom or the world, obesity would not be on it. It's not that big a deal, quite frankly. It's a matter for individuals. Yes, it is linked to various diseases. Yes, it is linked to type 2 diabetes, but type 2 diabetes, like obesity, is reversible. You don't need drugs for it. You can just change your diet and lose weight. So it's down to people whether they want to be overweight or obese or not. And I would say for a lot of people, it's a perfectly rational thing to do, actually, to get a bit of a beer belly if you like beer, if you like eating food. Not everybody is that bothered about how they look. Not everybody is that bothered about reducing every health risk in life. It's rather like smoking or alcohol itself.
Well, there you go, Steve. I think you just said...
He's trying to wind me up. Listen, we know the evidence is clear, that word evidence again, that we are becoming too fat. I used to be fat myself. I was like a pig in a blanket. Seriously, I was, right? And I had to do something about it. I had to wake up and stop dodging the salad for a start.
There's nothing like a reformed sinner, is there, Steve?
Obesity is crushing the NHS, literally. We have got to do something about it. I have to say, and World Obesity Day, your other contributor is right. It's all about graphs. It's all about academics, all of that. I'm the guy that for the last 20 years has rolled his sleeves up and helped thousands of people to lose weight. And that one of the things we have to get out there, and this is important, is to actually start saying to people, losing weight is possible. Because what I've read online today, all of these so-called academic experts are saying, this is the reason why you can't lose weight. Oh, there are environmental factors. There's this factor, there's that factor. How inspiring is that when someone is desperately wanting to lose weight? We have to start getting the message out there to people. Actually, being fat's too wrong. And yes, you are too gorgeous to be fat. And that's the sort of language we need to start using. Never mind all this academic claptrap.
Well, it's true. A lot of the accompanying material to World Obesity Day seems to talk about people who are living with obesity, Chris, and that it is the consequence of anyone and anything but themselves. Chris, a lot of the materials as well talk about the fact we need more taxes on sugar and fat, the fact that we need to clamp down on marketing.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting term, isn't it, living with obesity? This is a new politically correct word for it, rather than calling people fat or obese, which I have no problem doing. I mean, I wouldn't do it to their faces, but I think in general, general journalism, I think it's perfectly reasonable to talk about obese people and fat people.
You get a punch.
But yeah, the whole purpose of it really is to make this seem like it's something that happens to people, rather than it's something that is a consequence of their actions, or indeed their inactions very often. And that then leads to the next stage, which is, well, the government's got to do something about it, because the people can't do anything about it. They're just trapped in this obesogenic environment, they call it. We can't help ourselves from picking up every chocolate bar we see. So we need the government to, in some way, move the chocolate bars to a different shelf in the supermarket, or put the price of the chocolate bars up, or fizzy drinks. Obviously, we have a sugar tax already. None of these things have been shown to work anywhere. The sugar tax hasn't been shown to work in this country. People are pretty they will sacrifice a lot of things in their household shopping before they change their diet fundamentally. You need people who want to change their diet. You need people to be able to cook as well. There are a whole range of things that the government can't really do a great deal about, but it's going to keep on trying. And I find it very frustrating. We've heard the word evidence mentioned a few times. Where is the evidence that any of this stuff works? Well, we're trying quite a few of these policies out. Very soon, we've got a so-called junk food advertising ban. We're moving the products in the supermarkets. We're banning the bog-offs and so on. Let's assess it in a few years' time. And if obesity has come down, I will come on this show and say, fair enough, I was wrong about it. But if it's continued going up at much the same rate as it's always done, let's repeal them and rethink our approach to this.
Now, Steve, I've been looking at some of the magazines and the depiction of people with larger bodies, and it does seem like they are being celebrated, but others would argue that they're just being represented. Surely it's not good for people's overall well-being and mental health to constantly feel like they are some kind of lesser being for being a bit overweight.
Oh, there's no doubt. Listen, we've gone from the catwalk to the fat walk in the United Kingdom. I mean, everything nowadays is all about, as I said earlier, loving those curves and using these wonderful euphemisms that actually means you're too fat. We should actually, one of the solutions strategically by the government, I'm not into nanny state, however I'll say it, would be banning anything to do with the normalisation of obesity, especially when I hear today that child obesity is going to increase by 100%. That is worrying. So
Chris
yes,
is shaking. Steve, Chris is shaking his head. He doesn't believe these figures.
No, it won't. I'll happily put a serious amount of money on it. It won't do. These projections are based on nothing. They have no idea what causes obesity in the first place. These people, they just look at some historic trend and go, well, we think it's gonna. It won't do. I promise you that. If these projections were right, then about half of us would already be obese. The actual figure is somewhere.
Hang on a minute. Where's your evidence for saying that, Mr. Academic? Come on.
Office for National Statistics. What's they call it? The Health Survey for England. I believe it's 28%.
You're projecting into the future. Are you saying they've projected into the future and today's numbers are wrong?
Well, all the projections in the past have been wrong, and we're not on track for the projections they made for 2030. So I'm going to say these ones are probably wrong too. It's not been a great couple of years for public health modelling, and these obesity projections are no better than...
Well, just lastly, if we don't agree with, well, mostly, I think all three of us probably agree that we don't really want heavy-handed nanny state intervention. But Chris, just quickly, and then I'll ask you, Steve, if you were to give a sort of world obesity manifesto of how to get people to not be obese and not be overweight, because by and large it is a bad thing for people to be grossly overweight, what would you suggest that the government should be doing?
Exercise more and eat less, and whatever you find easy or relatively easy to kind of abstain from, do that. I love eating cheese. I love eating chocolate. I tend not to do very much of it because if I do it, I get fat. And it's really a very simple trade-off for people. It's harder for other people, I accept. And there's some people who have genetic problems or are on medication, and they
or
genuinely
addiction
can't
to
help
food, I think.
And we shouldn't be stigmatising those people. I don't think we should be stigmatising anyone.
Well, there you go. A bit of an education campaign rather than stigmatisation or more taxes. Steve?
Are you asking me?
Yes.
Yes, well, I would say to people there are three things. Number one, stop making excuses because most of them are an absolute claptrap. Number two, start living 80-20. Don't do rigid diets. Eat 80% well, 20% a bit of what you fancy. And the third thing I wrote down here was infuse your mind rather than your stomach. When that's sorted out, the belly shrinks.
Well, I imagine there are lots of people at home watching this who perhaps have a packet of biscuits next to them, but maybe they should only have one or two. Thank you very much indeed, Steve Miller, former presenter of Fat Families and head of lifestyle economics at the IEA, Christopher Snowdon. Thank you very much indeed. Now, lots of you have been sending in your thoughts on the topics we've been discussing today. On Sunak's plan for channel migrants, Bev says, I think anyone who comes here illegally should not get citizenship and should be removed. Well, straight to the point. there. On the Boris Johnson inquiry, Greg says Partygate shouldn't be ignored as it mocked the population, but also highlighted that, in my opinion, the rules weren't needed in the first place, because if they were needed, those involved in Partygate would have headed straight for their panic rooms. Well, that's true, and that's what Emma Webb earlier was saying, that this really highlights, mostly, just how ridiculous the rules were at the time. And on Sadiq Khan's comments, Dave says, Mr Khan obviously doesn't have a clue about the borough of Ealing, where I live. Calling out the far right in an area with many ethnic minorities is a bit rich. I think if there were a gathering of any kind of people that do not agree with him, they will be likewise accused, irrespective of background. You might be right there. You might be right there. Now, thank you very much for sending into your views. We're moving on to a very different topic. The venue, which hosted a cabaret drag-style event for parents of young children, has vowed to continue hosting shows despite a growing campaign against them. Despite criticism, the Cabaret show, run by Vault Festival, will continue after organisers issued a statement explaining its target audience and condemning inexcusable threats of violence and assault against the artists and wider LGBT plus community. Joining me to discuss this is political commentator Dominique Samuels, who's been looking into this quite a bit. Dominique, thank you very much indeed for joining us this afternoon on Real Britain. So what's the latest? This show, which has babies and drag queens, is going to go ahead.
Yeah, it's going to go ahead, and instead of actually taking accountability for the many parents and just normal people who can see what's wrong with it, they've instead decided to blame the response on media harassment and online trolls. They postponed a few of their shows previously, they announced, because of the backlash, and I think rightly so. And I think what's interesting is they've tried to frame this as being about homophobia, quite frankly, by making sure it talks about queerness, it talks about LGBTQ. And I would say that I think that's pretty homophobic in itself, because what we're talking about here is highly sexualized themes being targeted at children. This is a baby cabaret. On their Instagram page, they refer to it as baby sensory, and their target audience for children are those 0 to 2 years old. So we know it's targeted at children. Why does that need to be associated with gayness, with queerness? There's many gay people, many queer people, if you like, I don't really get that term, that would not be comfortable performing virtually naked for children. There are many that wouldn't. So why are we making this about homophobia or transphobia?
They say, presumably, that this is all a harmless bit of fun. The babies won't really know what's going on. It's all okay, you know, stop being such a small-minded bigot. What do you say to that?
Well, I think that's absolute nonsense, because children's brains are literally like sponges. I've had child psychologists, I've had people that are trained in child safeguarding, so they know what they're talking about, more than a few weirdos on the internet. They've said that there are real safeguarding concerns here, and it would factually be considered grooming, that sort of behaviour, because they are desensitizing children to highly sexualized themes. And who is to say that one of those children, because it's not just babies actually, there's pictures on their website, again posted by them on Facebook, of toddlers in nappies that can know what's going on because they absorb it. Who's to say that one of those kids don't then mimic the things that they've seen in the playground? There are real concerns here, and they can't be brushed under the carpet.
Well, I'm sure they would, Dominique, I'm sure they would dispute the term grooming, but I do completely understand where you're coming from. It does seem rather perverse, the whole thing. I think most people at home will agree with that too. Thank you very much, Dominique. That's all we've got time for on that one, but I'm sure you'll be keeping an eye on it for us, so we know what's going on out there. Thank you very much indeed. So we reached out to the Vault Festival, the organisers of the drag show in question. They gave this response to some of the criticism they have received. We are aware of comments on social media directed at Cabaret, part of the 2023 Vault Festival programme. The cabaret show is designed for parents with sensory moments for babies and is a fun and welcoming space for parents with young babies. Vault Festival exists to support live performance and artistic talent and is proud to platform events that are welcoming and accessible for all, with audience safety always a top priority. We stand against the inexcusable threats of violence and assault against our programmed artists, our staff, and directed at the LGBTQIA+ community, and are supporting the effective artists. So there you go, that's what they have to say. Now, to end the show, something a little bit different. My team have scoured local newspapers for 3 fun local stories to brighten up your day. This is Real Britain. At 3, residents of a street in Liverpool have been left without post for nearly 6 months after Royal Mail suspended deliveries following one of its workers being bitten by a dog. Residents of Ashvale in the Wavertree area of the city said that the decision has caused them to miss important letters, including cancer test results and hospital appointment notifications. So there you go, a bitten post officer. Now at 2, a pregnant cow at a nature reserve in County Durham has been rescued by the Tyne and Wear Fire and Rescue Service. Working with the farmer and a local vet, they were able to free the animal from the thick mud. So this is a good news story, I think. According to reports, it was a tricky rescue due to the cow's pregnancy, but after 3 hours, she and her unborn calf were released without harm. Isn't that lovely local news? And lastly, at number 1, Animal Rebellion campaigners occupied the egg aisle of a Sainsbury's in Nottingham. 3 individuals from the Climate and Animal Group peacefully protested in the shop and held placards calling for the UK to adopt a safer and sustainable plant-based food system free from animal suffering, climate breakdown and food shortages. Sainsbury's was targeted as the group claimed they sell more than 50% of all RSPCA-assured products in the UK. So, these are the kind of stories that don't make it to the national press very often, but they are in our local newspapers. So if you want to support local news, please do send in your stories next week. Send them to me on gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweet me at gbnews. There are so many wonderful stories out there, a lot of them quite humorous in those local papers, so do let me know. You have, of course, been watching Real Britain with me, Emily Carver. Thank you very much indeed for your company this afternoon. The show is on every Saturday at 2 p.m, so please do tune in next week. But for now, I'll leave you with the weather.
Hello there, I'm Craig Snow and here's your latest forecast from the Met Office. Well, as we go through the next few days, although this weekend will be rather cloudy and dry, next week is certainly turning a good deal colder with the risk of some snow for some of us. Out there at the moment, we've still got this area of high pressure firmly in charge across the country. This cold front will just be a focus of some showers across some eastern and northern parts of the UK. But for most of us, as we end Saturday, it's going to be dry but rather cloudy, with the best of any clear skies up across western Scotland. Later on in the night, we will start to see some wintry showers affecting the very far north of Scotland. But for many, no real problems with temperatures, no lower than around 3 to 4 degrees for a lot of the country. So Sunday for England and Wales, a very similar day to Saturday. Plenty of cloud around, risk of some showers across eastern parts of the country. For Scotland and Northern Ireland, I'm hopeful we will see a little bit more in the way of brightness compared to Saturday, but also the risk of some showers, and these showers once again will be wintry, especially across the high ground. Temperatures on Sunday at best around 8 to 9 degrees, but factor in the wind, it will still be feeling pretty cold if you are out and about. Into Sunday evening, across the north, an increase in risk of some showers, especially across Scotland, where these will turn increasingly to sleet and snow, even at lower levels, with the risk of some ice too. So do take some extra care if you are out and about early on Monday. Could just see some disruption courtesy of that snow. Further south, a colder night than Saturday night, maybe a touch of frost in a few spots where we do see the skies remain clearest. And then as we go into Monday, Tuesday and Wednesday, it turns even colder still across the UK. Risk of some snow, chiefly across the high ground at first, but as we go into middle of the week, we may even see some snow moving into the south too. But you can keep an eye on all the information through the warnings on the Met Office website.
I'm Mark White. As GB News Home and Security Editor, I cover those key issues that are so important to you. Our authorities, our communities doing all they can to combat violent crime. With the public services under unbearable strain, why are we still failing to control our borders? Defence, the first priority of any government, has been continually hollowed out. Can we trust our politicians to protect the armed forces? Join me, Mark White, on GB News.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything, I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things, we've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it. Like, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices